Good afternoon, everyone. I'm so delighted that you're here. My name is Stacy Morrone. I'm the Associate Vice President for Learning Technologies and also the Dean of IT for the Indianapolis campus. And this is just a thrilling day to see such a packed house. And so this is an important day for us. I wanted to do a little bit of a trip down memory lane that helps set the context for where we are today. So in collaboration with some of my very good colleagues here at IUPUI, Emily Wren and Mary Beth Myers, we formed the Classroom Committee at IUPUI, which is made up of representatives from the Architect's Office, faculty, Adaptive Educational Services, as well as Emily's team, and the UITS teams, and of course the registrar. And so we've spent some time over the last few years creating beautiful new classrooms. And we did that with the intention to have these classrooms transform to ones where there's a projector facing the front of the room and there's tablet armchairs or fixed seating of some sort that made it hard for us to support active learning. So we set on this mission to do more to create active learning classrooms at IUPUI. And we've had some very good success. We now have some really wonderful classrooms. At the same time, we also know that to simply create these classrooms and hope that the faculty will know what to do in what feels like a very different kind of classroom is something that it wasn't enough to just create the classrooms. We had to do more. We had to step back and say, how can we help the faculty, support the faculty in thinking differently about their teaching practices when they're in rooms like this? So a good example of this is a fairly brand new classroom. It's about a year old now, that is in our University Hall building. It's called the Immersive Classroom. And this is one where there's an interactive video wall, there's flexible furniture, there's wireless technologies that allow students to share their content that's on their tablet or their phone or their laptop, and to wirelessly put that up on the screen for their classmates and the professor to have a dialogue about what they're learning. So this is really different than what many of us have thought about when we think about our classrooms. So the Mosaic initiative then was something that we said, all right, let's do something. Let's really address this challenge. And so the Mosaic initiative is intended to support, to provide comprehensive support for the faculty who are going to be teaching in these active learning classrooms. So you might wonder, how did we get the name Mosaic? And so this is an interesting story. We consulted with a good colleague of ours at the University of Iowa that has a program called TILE. And this program has some similarities to what is now our Mosaic program, with one important difference. The classrooms that support active learning and which there are TILE fellows, these are all very similar kinds of classrooms, all designed with a specific design, layout, those kinds of things. And when we were consulting with our colleague, Jean Foreman from Iowa, I said, Jean, it's not that we have a tile, it's that we have a mosaic of different kinds of classrooms. And so that word stuck, and it formed the basis for the beginning of our initiative, which is really that there isn't one type of active learning classroom across all of our campuses of Indiana University, IUPUI, the regional campuses. This is a case where there's lots of different kinds of classrooms. And so the goal is to make these classrooms more able to support active learning. So some are very high-end technology, some are not. And so we have the full range, or the full mosaic, of different kinds of classrooms. So before I turn it over to Executive Vice Chancellor Kathy Johnson, who's going to actually introduce our new Mosaic Faculty Fellows, there's three teams of mine that I really want to acknowledge as part of what they do to support classrooms. The Learning Space Design team, the Classroom Technology Services team, and the Classroom Support team. So these are people who work very quietly behind the scenes every day to make these classrooms work. And we are grateful for all that they do, often under very stressful conditions, especially when semester's starting tomorrow and we're still trying to get the classrooms ready. So I'm grateful for all that they do to support our, excuse me, to support our classrooms. I also think it was up here a minute ago. I want to thank our sponsors. Facet is here. There's a Leadership Institute going on in the building just upstairs. And so we have many members of the Facet Leadership Institute that have joined us for lunch. And then the Center for Teaching and Learning is also a sponsor of the event. So before I get to Kathy, where's Tracey? There she is. So I want to introduce Tracey Birdwell. She very capably leads our Mosaic faculty, the Mosaic Fellows program across all campuses of IU. And you're going to hear from Tracey in a few minutes, but you need to memorize Tracey's face. She is all things Mosaic, and we'll be working extensively with the fellows when they go off to do their work starting this afternoon. So now I really am ready to turn it over to Kathy Johnson.
Actually, Stacy, wait. Before you step down, you have to model your scarf. Stacy cares so deeply about this initiative that her scarf has the logo on it, which is amazing. And let me just take a quick moment and thank Stacy for her leadership. I know she's thanked her teams, but I'm just thrilled and delighted about this launch and about the fact that IUPUI is able to have 14 Mosaic Fellows this year, which is phenomenal. So IUPUI really has been designed for student success. When I travel around the country, I think one of our signature strengths is the amount of focus that we put into supporting our students, both graduate and undergraduates, while also maintaining research excellence and the like. And this is the very sort of program that I think can take full advantage of that culture while also respecting and honoring the fact that so much of what students gain from being in college happens in the classroom. I've made mistakes in my past roles. I was a department chair, and I think Pratibha Verma-Nelson told me about scale-up classrooms, and I thought that they were just so amazing. I immediately wrote a little grant and got some money to put one in my department or in the space that we use to teach research methods. I did the same thing when I was a dean of University College. I took one of our classrooms and busily worked to make sure that it was transformed. And my mistake was just assuming that everyone would think that was as cool as I did. And a lot of people didn't. It felt very scary for some people. They were afraid of the technology not working, or what if students did things other than what they were supposed to do. And so this is the sort of program that I really should have started trying to cultivate in collaboration with others of my colleagues. This is hard work. We know that classroom learning is so important, but it also takes intentionality and design. So I'm thrilled to introduce our fellows, who I hope will be leaders and champions on our campus. I hope, quite honestly, that they will help me. I'm actually going to be teaching in a Mosaic classroom in the spring and need to absorb some of their wisdom. So just so thrilled about this. So my main job is to introduce our fellows, and so if you wouldn't mind, I'm going to mention your name and say a little bit about your department, but if you could stand so that everyone can see you. And this is a really packed, scary room, so hopefully you're not shy. First, I'm just going to go in alphabetical order. First, we have Andy Bushno, who's an assistant professor in the Department of English. Thank you, Andy. Yay. Also, Lisa Contino, who's a senior lecturer in the wonderful Department of Psychology. Rob Elliott, lecturer in the Department of Computer Information and Graphics Technology. We also have Erin Engels, who's assistant clinical professor in political science. And Nancy Evans, who's trustee lecturer in the Department of Computer Information and Graphics Technology. Patrick Kinsman, lecturer in art history. Brian Crone, assistant professor in tourism, conventions, and event management. Madupe Lobodi, associate professor in the Department of History and the Department of Museum Studies. Madupe is also a public scholar at IUPUI. Gino Lindino, who's associate lecturer in the Department of Chemistry. We have Kathy Mars, associate professor in the Department of Biology. Meg Mormon, assistant clinical professor in the School of Nursing, Department of Community and Health Systems. Jenny Nelson, lecturer in the Department of Earth Sciences. Audrey Rickey, lecturer in the Department of Anthropology. And Louis Zhu, lecturer in the Department of Human-Centered Computing in the School of Informatics and Computing. So congratulations to all of you, and I'm looking forward to learning from you.
Hello. I'm to introduce the speakers, but I just want to point out we have so many fellows, we forgot one. So could Sean Boyne, professor of law, stand up? You didn't get out of it. Thank you. We are fortunate to have two leading authorities on active learning spaces and the pedagogical practices that best support active learning, Drs. J.D. Walker and Dr. Christina Petersen. Walker, a research associate, and Christina, an education program specialist, both from the Center for Educational Innovation at the University of Minnesota. Minnesota has been a leader in the development of and research on active learning classrooms in higher ed. For example, Minnesota's Brunix Hall, which I'm sure Walker and Christina will talk about today, boasts classrooms designed expressly to support active and collaborative learning, and the classrooms in that building serve approximately 20,000 students annually. While at Minnesota, Walker and Christina have supported instructors who teach in these spaces, have taught in these rooms, and have researched, among other topics, how students and instructors interact in active learning classrooms and how learning outcomes can differ in active learning classrooms as compared to traditional classrooms. Together and with other researchers, Walker and Christina have co-authored numerous articles investigating the effectiveness of teaching and learning in active learning classrooms and sharing practical advice for instructors who teach in active learning classrooms. Most recently, our authors have co-authored a guide to teaching and learning in an active learning classroom, which was published this summer, and you all received a flyer for a discount for that book up front. Walker and Christina have spoken widely on active learning classrooms, and I am pleased that they are here with us today to help us begin a larger conversation about space and pedagogy at IUPUI. So please join me in welcoming Walker and Christina.
Thank you. All right. It is an honor to be here, and so impressed. The city, we've had of the city, and this mosaic. Extremely impressive how different factions improve learning spaces. So today we're going to talk about a wide variety of things. This is the University of Minnesota campus. It straddles the Mississippi River. We also have in St. Paul. And this is the Brunix. It was built in 2010. It has 14 active learning classrooms in it that range in size from seating 27 students up to 171 students. And this is what a typical classroom in action looks like in one of these buildings. And you'll hear a little more from Walker about what is the assets that are in the room. So this is a very brief outline of what we're hoping to cover today. I'm going to begin by talking about active learning and some of the evidence that shows that it works. And then Walker's going to talk about active learning classrooms and the evidence that they work and are effective. And then I'm going to talk about practical methods and tips, strategies you can use for teaching in an active learning classroom. And we're going to end with Walker talking about new research that he's doing that's lending some insight into why these active learning classrooms may be as successful as they are. So, as probably most everybody in this room knows already, active learning is an instructional strategy that engages students in the learning process. And I'm going to try to walk down the stairs without tripping. All right, things are going well now. And it often makes sense when you contrast this with passive learning. And passive learning, the traditional lecture method, is basically where you have a one-to-many situation. All the students are facing towards that professor who is the purveyor of all knowledge and is giving that to the student. And of course, that's how those classrooms are designed. So there is a lot of evidence that active learning results in better student learning outcomes, students have better experiences, and what I've done here is just put together a list of meta-analyses. So each one of these articles is a composite of other primary articles that showed benefits for active learning. These represent studies done in different disciplines, in higher education, and different types of situation. So there is a great deal of evidence to support it, and my slides will be available if you'd like to check out any of these resources. But I thought what would be nice, rather than to show you a list of meta-analyses, is to tell you just about one specific study, to give you a little flavor for the types of research that are being done out there on active learning and the benefits. And I chose this study because it's a very simple intervention, and it produced some pretty interesting results. So this is a classic article from 1987, and it was a study done looking at introducing active learning techniques and then having a control classroom that all of the content was kept the same. So 2 instructors, each teaching the same course. And each instructor had 2 sections within the course. So that made for a very nice setup with an experimental and a control section for each of the instructors. And the experimental section, the instructors lectured as they normally did, but they paused at 3 times during their lecture for 2 minutes and asked the students to turn to their neighbor and share their notes. That's it. That's all they did. And so the students talked. In the control lecture, they just lectured as normal without those pauses. At the very end, the students took a common exam. And what I'm going to show you are the differences in those exam scores on the next slide. And so what you see for both instructor number 1 and instructor number 2, the lecture with pauses, students performed quite a bit better than the lecture with no pauses. I find this amazing because really the only difference is that for 6 minutes, these instructors did nothing. They just paused and had their students turn to each other and start talking. So because we're talking about active learning, it would be a little disingenuous if we didn't do active learning in our presentation. So sometimes when I talk about this study, I have people say, oh, 2 minutes, what can students actually cover in 2 minutes? So I thought we could give it a try. So what I'd like you to do, when I say go, not yet, turn to the person next to you, exchange your name, your department, and your college. If you have time and you're teaching, talk about what class or classes you'll be teaching this semester. If you still have time, why are you attending this workshop? Discuss that, give a reason for that. And if there's still time, what do you think are the advantages and disadvantages of the lecture method as an instructional strategy. And what I'm going to do is I have brought my timer. And I'm going to time it for 2 minutes. And when the timer goes off, I will ask you to stop talking, and then we'll see how it went for you. So, ready, go. Of course, I use. All right, time's up. 2 minutes. Finish your sentence, finish your conversation, and if I could get your attention, I'd like to do a little demonstration of what you talked about. You all are a great audience. As soon as I said go, this room just erupted into discussion. So what I'd like to do is have a show of hands. So how many of you at your table got as far as exchanging names? Raise your hand. How many got as far as exchanging your department and college? Raise your hand. How many got as far as talking about the class or classes you'll be teaching this semester? You might want to look around the room. There's a lot of hands up for this. Did anybody get as far as talking about why they attended this workshop? Did anyone get as far as talking about advantages or disadvantages of the lecture strategy? All right, look around the room. This is what you can do in 2 minutes. So, and it actually can seem like an eternity if you're standing up here and you've asked a question and students haven't responded to it. So this is just an example of a very simple active learning activity that could be incorporated into your teaching. Now there are lots and lots of different active learning activities that could be included, and this slide has some examples. Note sharing is the one I just talked about. Application cards is another one. This is where you ask students to come up with a real-world application of some abstract concept that you're teaching in your class. Minute paper asks the students to pause, give them a question, and have them write for a minute on it. And it can go as far as we instructors at the University of Minnesota, actually myself included, who have semester-long projects where teams work on them in an active fashion. And the reason that I have this up here is to show you that this is really a continuum. And instructors don't have to jump in and do semester-long projects to begin. You can start small. You can start small with the note sharing, which doesn't take much effort at all or take much time from your teaching. And I didn't have much time to talk about these methods, but in your handout, I believe beginning on page 3, there's a list of different short active learning activities you could do in your teaching with some explanations on how to use them. So that might be useful for you later. So, usually at this point, somebody in the audience is saying, you know, Christina, that's great. I mean, all these active learning techniques, I think they're wonderful, but you don't understand. In my field, I have X amount of content to cover and only so much time. So I can't afford to give up even 6 minutes for my content coverage. I get this question a lot, and I understand that many classes are prerequisites for other classes. Medical school, right? It is a matter of life and death. But I think what's going on here is that there's an assumption associated with that. And I think the assumption is that as long as I'm standing up here and words are coming out of my mouth, you're getting it, you're understanding it. And we know that's not the case. So just because you say it doesn't mean it's been covered in the sense that students understand it. So often what we say is less is more. So if students go into depth, into a few categories in your discipline, learn it well, work with it actively, that is a way they can gain skills in how to approach learning your discipline. And in fact, the last slide I'm going to show you, second to last actually, there's been some studies that have actually looked at this. This was a 10-year study in a biology class where over the 10 years, they moved to more and more active learning techniques, and they could quantify the loss or the drop in content coverage over those 10 years. And all the students over those 10 years took a common exam, and what they found that with a 44% decrease in content coverage, not only did the students do as well, but there was actually a 13% increase in their learning. So this is a proof of concept that you can take away some content without harming student learning. And the very last slide that I'm going to show you is something called the bookends model, which was developed by Carl Smith at the University of Minnesota as a way to start with active learning for people who are used to lecturing. And basically, it's dividing your lecture into chunks, dividing those chunks up with some short active learning activities like turn to your neighbor, begin with some type of advanced organizer, and end with a summary. And there's nothing magical about these times on the books, so you could have a very thin magazine for your lecture if you want to do more active learning. So this is a very brief introduction to active learning, evidence that it works, and some ways to do it. And now I'm going to turn it over to Walker, who will talk about active learning classrooms.
Thank you, Christina. I may not need this. Hi, folks. My name is Walker, and now that Christina has talked with you a bit about the notion of active learning itself, as well as the evidence that it works, what I want to do is discuss with you a bit the idea of new classroom spaces designed to facilitate active learning and the evidence. Now, at Indiana, I think you are all very fortunate to have a variety of new learning spaces, as Stacy mentioned earlier. Thank you very much. There we are, okay. You have a variety of learning spaces available to you, which I think is a wonderful thing. I think it's something you're really doing right here at Indiana. This is not something we did right at Minnesota. What we did was back in 2006 to 2007, we constructed a lot of one kind of active learning space, what we call active learning classrooms, which are pictured in the bottom right there. We modeled these spaces on projects done at MIT and at North Carolina State. And so you can see the classrooms. They seat 9 students at round tables. There are microphones so students can be heard across the larger rooms. There are display screens and whiteboards associated with each of the tables. When we first constructed these rooms back in 2007, we really had no idea what effect these rooms would have, if any at all, on teaching and learning. So at that time, we set out to investigate the impact of these spaces by designing a series of controlled comparison studies. 2 of those studies, represented by the horizontal arrows here, compared near identical sections of the same class, one of which was taught in a traditional room, one of which was taught in an active learning classroom. One of those studies, represented by the vertical arrow on the right, compared two near-identical sections of the same class, both of which were taught in an active learning classroom, but one of which used a more lecture-based expository pedagogy, whereas in the other case, the instructor adapted her class to the room itself. So I want to touch just briefly on each of these three studies with you today. So in the first of these studies, we examined an introductory science class for non-majors, and our faculty partner taught two sections of this class in the same semester. He taught one Tuesday, Thursday, and one was Monday and Wednesday. And he held everything he possibly could constant between these two sections. So he used the same syllabus, the same books and materials, the same assignments and tests and quizzes, and importantly, he used the same teaching methods in both of the sections. So he tried to hold that constant between these two sections. It was a mix of lecture pedagogy with whole class questioning. Of course, students are not here to be subjects in an experiment, right? They're here to get an education. So you can't just randomly assign them to treatment and control conditions as you might in a more formal study. But what you can do, and what we did, was to collect information on students about their background, their demographics, their academic aptitude, so that we could control for those factors at the analysis phase. When we examined the two sections of this class, the one taught in the traditional room and the one taught in the ALC, what we discovered was that students in the two sections were identical, statistically speaking, on all the variables that we could measure, on their age, their ethnicity, their year in school, all these sorts of things, except for one, and that variable was their composite ACT score. On that, there was a significant difference in favor of the traditional section. Now, as you might know, ACT scores are actually pretty good predictors of performance for freshmen and sophomores in introductory level courses like this one. So this means that we would expect students in the traditional room to have higher average grades than students in the ALC section. So we generated a model which was designed to predict final grades in each section of the course for the traditional and the ALC sections of this course. As you can see from the green bars in this graph, the predicted grade for the traditional students in the traditional classroom was a good bit higher than it was in the ALC room. But as you can also see from the blue bars in this graph, students in the traditional room did about as well as we expected them to. But students in the ALC section of this class outperformed expectations by a substantial margin, nearly 5 percentage points. So that they caught up, statistically speaking, with the students in the traditional room. Now, we also wanted to examine the impact of the new classrooms on the student learning experience. So we designed and we tested a student survey designed to measure the 5 aggregated variables you see on the left here: student engagement, enrichment of their learning experience, flexibility of the space, that sort of thing. And as you can probably see, the blue bars representing the ALC section, the green, the traditional section, students were pretty positive on average about their experiences in these rooms, significantly so in most cases. And the final thing that we wanted to measure was what's actually going on in the classroom. So we randomly selected 50% of the class meetings for the traditional and ALC sections, and we sat in on those class meetings. And using a tested observation protocol, we recorded the levels of about 50 different variables at 5-minute intervals throughout these sections. And we were primarily interested in what the professor is doing and what sorts of learning activities are going on in these two rooms. So, and what we found was, remember, the professor tried to do the same thing in both of these sections, right? Explicitly did. What we found was that there were a lot of differences. So he stayed at the podium substantially more in the traditional room, left the podium substantially more in the ALC room. He spent a good bit more time consulting with groups of students in the ALC room, even though he was attempting to do, and in fact thought he did, the same thing in both rooms. So space has an almost ineluctable effect on people's behavior, we think. So these were pretty striking results, and we wanted to confirm them. So we set up a replication of this study in a different and larger class. So this class was taught in Bob Brunick's hall, the hall you see pictured there, which has 15 to 18 ALC rooms, depending on how you count them. One section of this course was taught in a traditional classroom in a nice brand spanking new lecture hall, and the other in an active learning classroom. We don't have a whole lot of time today, so I'll be quick about this one. But it was basically set up in the same way the other study was, with the professor teaching both sections of the class and trying to hold constant everything she could between those two sections. In this case, we found Exactly the same thing when we compared the two sections of the class on demographic and background variables. This should look familiar to you. There was a significant advantage in terms of ACT score for the traditional kids. This should also look familiar to you. When we generated expected grades for both sections of the class, there was a significant advantage for the kids in the traditional room, whereas students in the ALC room outperformed expectations by a substantial margin. We also found that, once more, students were very positive about their experience in these rooms, significantly so in most cases in terms of engagement and enrichment of their experience. And finally, we found again that the room made a difference to instructor behavior. The instructor just wandered around more, did much more consulting with groups of students and things like that, although she was, once more, trying to do the same thing in both of those rooms. One thing that those two studies don't address is the role of teaching and learning activities. Right? So does it matter how you teach in an active learning classroom? Or is that more or less irrelevant than the space is doing all the work? Those studies don't address that issue because we tried to hold teaching and learning activities constant between the two conditions. So what we did to test the question of whether or not it matters if you adapt your course to the learning space was, we worked with a professor who taught the same course in the same active learning classroom, this time not simultaneously but sequentially. So she taught the first version of the class in an active learning classroom in an unrevised manner. So it was using basically expository lecture-based pedagogy, but it was in a relatively large active learning classroom. And she then enrolled in a faculty development program which was explicitly designed to revise her course based on the constructive use of technology and the incorporation of student-centered learning techniques. She then taught the same course again in the same active learning classroom she did before, but having changed the pedagogy, using many of the student-centered learning techniques that Christina just discussed with you. Here, when we looked at the two sections of the class, this time the lecture section versus the active learning section, we found the students to be equivalent on all the variables that we could measure, including their ACT scores, so we would expect them to do about as well as one another. So the expected grades are on the left-hand side, and they're approximately equivalent between the two sections. But as you can see, the students in the active learning section, in the active learning pedagogy section, substantially outperformed students where the pedagogy was lecture-based. We also found, when we looked at different grade quartiles among these classes, so we're looking at the top performers and the bottom performers, that the advantage of active learning pedagogy held across all of those quartiles. There was a smaller advantage to the kids at the top, because they're kind of getting close to the ceiling anyway, right? But there was an advantage for students all over the grade distribution. And we also found that the advantage of the active learning approach held across the different assignments in the class. So it wasn't just the more narrative assignments like the financial planner and the case studies, but also things like the final exam and the quizzes the students took. The active learning kids, once more, outperformed the kids using traditional pedagogy. So just to conclude here, we think that given the controls we had in place for these studies, this is pretty strong evidence that when compared to traditional classrooms, classes held in active learning spaces, they enable students to outperform grade expectations, they alter instructor behavior, hopefully in good ways, and they improve the student learning experience. And if you're teaching in one of these rooms, there are good things to be expected if you adapt your teaching to the space that you're teaching in. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Christina.
And that's a great segue for what I'm going to talk about next, which are some practical tips and strategies that you can use when teaching in an active learning classroom. The space is different, and it presents some challenges to both instructors and students. And I've generalized these into two basic categories. Challenges related to the change and difference in the relationship between instructor and students and each other, and then challenges just due to the physical space itself. So let's start talking about the changes in relationship. So it really impacts three different relationships. It impacts how the students interact with you, the instructor, how they interact with each other, and how they interact with the material. So let's begin by talking about how it changes their relationship with you. Typically, in a lecture hall like this, where it's one-to-many, students are prepared for their role, which is passive listener. I'll sit in a chair and I'll listen to what you have to say. However, in this environment, there's nowhere to hide. So they are, in some ways, forced to interact with each other, and they're forced to interact with you. Many students find this to be an asset, but some students actually don't, because they come with an expectation of sitting passively. So your role, sometimes instructors have some difficulty transitioning from that role of information transmitter to the role of facilitating learning. So it's going from me to you, but now it's me to you and coming back with feedback. Along with that role changing between the faculty and the student, the roles change between the students and each other. So no longer are they sitting side by side and not talking. They are involved and interacting with you and interacting with each other in constructing their own learning. And they also can become more active interacting with the content as they work together at their tables with real data, with writing documents together in active learning activities. And this is actually a quote from Adam Finkelstein, who likes to say that the one who does the work does the learning, as sort of a mantra for active learning and the fact that interacting with the material is a way to help students learn. So, here are some suggestions on how to prepare your students for the active learning space, keeping in mind that some students may not be thrilled about being in that classroom. I suggest first and foremost, tell them from the beginning, put it in your syllabus, why you're using this particular classroom. It's not that you got stuck with it, but I chose this classroom specifically because research says that students learn better here, and my own experience as a teacher tells me also that you will learn better here. And in fact, you could consider putting together a script that you might say on the first day, and we put an example of that script in your handout. So that's just something you might say to students on your first day of class. Communicate your philosophy about student-teacher roles. Again, at the beginning of the semester, that this may be different than what you're used to. I am a facilitator of your learning. Therefore, I will not be necessarily giving you the answer. I will help you to find the answers. And that can reduce a lot of student frustration who just want the answer from you. Acknowledge that it might feel different. Students may feel uncomfortable there. You may feel uncomfortable there. But ask them to trust you and go along with you on that ride, and really, very importantly, tell them that you're going to solicit feedback early in the semester. Do it, and then respond to that feedback. That's the way you know the real problems they're having, and oftentimes some very simple solutions can be used. All right, now there are some problems just due to the physical space itself. For one, there's a lack of a focal point. So often we hear from our students in these rooms, I don't know where to look. Where's the front of the room? And you're moving all the time. I can't see you. There are multiple distractions. There are whiteboards, and there are screens, and you can see fellow students' laptops. And the technology can be overwhelming, especially for the instructor. So here are some suggestions to deal with this lack of a central focal point. And this sounds pretty simple, but it actually helps. So when I teach in these rooms, I direct attention. So if I'm walking from the whiteboard to the main screen, I'll say, all right, I'm now going to walk over to the main screen. I'm going to stand here for a while and talk about XYZ. And students can follow my direction. Students have told me that when I am using the main screen, they like me to stand in front of it. And what they say is they don't like having to look to you, then to the screen, to you, and then to the screen. So if I'm going to be using some type of visual background, I try to stand in front of it. And that's where a slide advancer like this helps a lot. And when the whole class is being addressed as a whole group, it's a good idea to have all of the student monitors identical, so there's no distracting information. Then when you break them up into their groups to have them work on something, then they can switch their monitors to their own content. And ask students to use microphones. They will learn to do it. They have to be reminded in the beginning, but that will help everybody hear better. And again, ask for that feedback early in the semester and respond to it so that they can tell you where they're having their problems. And overcoming multiple distractions. So active learning classrooms are pretty chaotic, especially when everybody is talking and working on something together. It can be loud. And so it might be a good idea to have some type of distraction speech at the beginning of the semester saying, you will notice there are a lot of distractions in this room. And here's what we're going to do. Or you could enlist the students to help you come up with a policy for laptops, talking, and different things in the classroom. Here's a technique that I have found very effective is if you want to pause for effect or you really want their attention, you can say, all right, everybody stop. I want you to put down your phones, close your laptops, shut down your electronic electronic devices, and focus on me. And what happens is they think, oh, something big's gonna happen. And you have just created a segue into having their attention for that period of time. Can't do it many times, but you can do it occasionally. Here's one that I think is probably the most important, at least from my standpoint as an instructor. It's easy to be active in these rooms, activities, discussions, students working, and sometimes easy to forget that students also need quiet time for reflection. So one thing you would want to consider is, at least once during your classes in these rooms, set aside a couple of minutes for students to be quiet, to gather their thoughts, to write things down, to just be able to assimilate everything that's going on. And it's loud in here. You all experienced that when you were having your conversations, and sometimes students will say it's difficult to have in-depth conversations, especially if it's a whole table talking together. Those tables are pretty big. So one thing you might want to consider is moving some of your in-class discussions online to your classroom management software. And there, students will have the time to think about what they've said and respond to it and be more comfortable in responding. And here's a big one. Imagine handing out a handout in this room right now. It would take you a long time. This is a trick I learned from one of the instructors there. Have folders for each table. And in those folders have all of the content that you'll be using for the class session. And when you need the content, say, all right, now pull out the blue paper from your folder. All right, now pull out the green paper. And then have them put their homework in the folders. So that's your form of communication back and forth. And of course, again, solicit early semester feedback and respond to it. And finally, the overwhelming technology. If you've never taught in one of these spaces before, my number one suggestion for you would be watch somebody else do it first. Even if it's just one class session, watch what they do, see how they do it. Now, you may be overwhelmed with the technology yourself as an instructor walking into this room, and you may decide, all right, I'm not gonna use the fancy touch screen at the front. It's a little too intimidating for me. That's great, but I would suggest that you would decide that ahead of time before you come into the class, and then tell students ahead of time what you're not going to use and why. First time I taught, I didn't use a lot of technology. I collected that feedback, and my students really dinged me and said, why is all this expensive technology here and you're not using it? Practice using the tech ahead of time. You might want to give like a first day tech speech and allow them to practice using the technology. Turn off the student monitors if they're not needed. It's easy to overlook that. And of course, solicit early semester feedback, see how things are going, and respond to that. So this was really a very quick whirlwind tour of practical suggestions for teaching in an active learning classroom. I'm going to turn it over to Walker now, who will talk about some exciting research about why active learning classrooms might be working.
Thank you, Christina. Slight technical glitch. I'm sure it's nothing important. There we go. Right. So, in the last few minutes of our talk today, what I want to do is discuss with you ongoing research that we're conducting at Minnesota, which addresses the question of how is it that active learning classrooms have the good effects that we think we have found. One answer to that question was alluded to in Christina's talk when she talked about changes in the relationships between students and instructors and among students themselves. This feature of the classroom is what we call social context. And this is something that students and instructors who have experience in these rooms have mentioned to us entirely unprompted since 2007. They know that something is different about the social situation when classes are held in rooms like this, and they make comments like the ones you can see on the slide here, both from students and from instructors. So about 3 years ago, we set out to try to study social context and to map its relationship with important academic outcomes and see if it had any effect on the student learning experience and the outcomes students achieve. So the first part of doing this was measurement, because we believe you can't study something effectively without being able to measure it accurately. Over multiple iterations, we have developed what we call the SCALE survey, which is a validated and reliability tested instrument. It consists of about a little bit less than 30 questions that we deliver to students. You can actually see some example questions from the SCALE survey on page 2 of your handout if you want to see what kinds of things we're asking. In general, the SCALE survey measures 4 different constructs. So it measures 2 aspects of student-instructor relations and 2 aspects of student-student relations. With instructors, we ask questions about the more formal aspects of students' relations with you, things about fairness and about grading, whether the instructor wants me to succeed in this class. On the informal side, we ask questions about whether you're acquainted with the instructor. Do you know something about him or her? Have you talked with them informally outside of class? Questions like that. Then there are 2 aspects to the student-student relations as well. One we call just student-student general relations. This is a grab bag of questions about whether other students respect you, whether you rely upon them, whether you trust them in class. And the final dimension is what we call students as instructors. So these are questions about students standing in the role of the instructor with respect to other students. Have other students learn things from you? Can you explain concepts to your fellow students? Things like that. Before we get to the findings from the social context study that we're doing, I want to take a quiz. I want you to take a quiz. So on page 2 of your handout, backside of the first page, you will see a display like this one, a little grid. On the left-hand side of this slide and of the grid in your handout are 5 different questions that are part of the SCALE survey. And what we want you to do is to take an educated guess about the relationship between these questions and student learning outcomes. In other words, if a student agrees with each of those statements, what are the implications for that student's learning in the class? Does it mean the student is more likely to do well, a positive relationship, likely to do poorly, a negative relationship, or is the statement just neutral with respect to student learning? So I'll give you a few moments to do that. If you have a pen, go ahead and mark them down on your grid. Take your best guess. And I think you can pretty clearly see where some of these statements are coming from, whether they measure formal aspects of instructor-student relations or informal aspects of student-student relations. At this point in the narrative, we've determined that we can measure something. We call that thing social context. What we don't know is whether that thing is important. Is it connected with anything that matters? So we set out to test social context and to test its relationship with the student learning experience and student learning outcomes. We're trying to answer the two questions up here that you can see in this slide. Is a social context different in different types of learning environments? And does it have any connection with anything we care about as educators, with learning outcomes or the student learning experience? So we've administered the social context survey in a lot of classes to a lot of students, and we have a large data set with which to examine this, with which to examine this question now. Taking the first question first, here's what we found so far. The question is social context different in traditional rooms as opposed to in active learning classrooms? The answer is generally yes. So for 3 out of the 4 dimensions we measured, we found significantly higher levels of social context in active learning classrooms across a whole variety of disciplines and class sizes as opposed to traditional rooms. So it seems like there's just more interacting going on in active learning classrooms of every sort, of the formal and of the informal sort. So that's the first question. Now I want you to look at what you wrote down on your paper. These are the answers to the quiz, as it were, and see if you correctly, if you anticipated the results that we found. So you can see some of the statements had a positive, some a negative relationship with student learning. How many of you correctly anticipated all 5 of these? Show of hands. Yeah. They're very surprising results, right? I wouldn't have anticipated all 5 of these. I didn't before we actually got the data in. So we can return to this in the question period if you like, but I think these are pretty surprising results, especially the negative ones, right? This is a way of foreshadowing the main result from our social context study, where we combine social context data with demographic information and aptitude predictors from student information systems to predict student outcomes in the classes we studied. What we found, generally speaking, is that 2 aspects of social context have a strong, significant, and positive relationship with student learning outcomes. And those are the 2 bars on the left, the purple and the green. Students acting as instructors seems to promote their learning. So students saying that other students have learned from me, I can explain things to students. That's good. The formal aspects of student-instructor relations are positively predictive of student learning outcomes. Right, so thinking that the instructor really wants you to learn in this class and is grading fairly and that you have the material you need to do well in the class. On the far right-hand side, the red bar, which goes down, you will notice, is also a strong predictor of student learning in the negative direction. So student-student general relations are bad for students. And this is really interesting because there's a lot of interacting going on, but it seems that some interaction really does promote student outcomes and some does not. And this fits with what some instructors have said to us. They've said, look, there's a lot of stuff going on at these tables. I don't know what it all is. I'm kind of worried that they're just talking about what kind of pizza they're going to order tonight. Are they really focused on the learning tasks? Right? It seems like there's some types of social contexts that are not constructive for students, that don't promote their learning. The informal aspects of student-instructor relations don't matter. There's a small effect size. It wasn't statistically significant. It doesn't seem to matter that much whether they know the name of your pet and things like that. These are results from the active learning classrooms. These are results from traditional rooms where we administered the social context survey. Right? You can see similar pattern. Students as instructor, student-instructor formal relations promote student learning. Student-student general relations retard student learning. Student-instructor informal relations don't matter. So this is true in both types of classrooms. So interesting stuff. Yeah. I want to describe to you in the briefest of ways, because I do want to save at least a few minutes for your questions. Another study that we've done which addresses the how question in a certain sense, because one question we very frequently get when we talk about active learning classrooms is it's the question of fitting students into rooms, right? So in terms of student butts in seats, an active learning classroom does not fit as many of them as a traditional hall does. It's less efficient in that sense. Right? So you're not going to pack as many people into that type of room. So active learning classrooms are less efficient than traditional rooms. However, if active learning classrooms can promote student learning outcomes in the way that we think we have found, we may be able to make more efficient use of the space that we have by reducing student seat time, by reducing the amount of time students spend in class. And that's what we set out to test with the chemistry professor you see on the right there, who taught an introductory chemistry class in a 350-person lecture hall, which you see on the left. I'm going to be fairly quick about this one to save time for questions, but what she essentially did was she split the class into thirds. So our biggest active learning classroom was about 125, right? So she split her 350-person class into thirds. She met with 1/3 of them on Monday, 1/3 of them on Wednesday, 1/3 of them on Friday, and did the same thing 3 times during the week. So she's reducing student-instructor contact hours by 66% for these kids. She also revised her class by creating online modules which students could access before class to cover the more didactic information delivery parts of the class, and she used the face-to-face time that she had to engage in active learning exercises of the sort that Christina has described to you. What we did was we basically studied the effect of this on the student learning experience and on student learning outcomes. We compared a control section in spring 2012 with 2 treatments, one in the following fall, one in the following spring. And what we found basically was that reducing student-instructor contact time by 66%, moving to an active learning format and an active learning room, improved student learning outcomes by quite a lot for one of the comparisons and by just a little bit in the other. It certainly didn't hurt. So and I think the lesson that we learned from this is really that it matters a lot less how much time students spend in their seats, and it matters much more what kind of classroom they're in and what they're doing when they're in their seats. And that, I think, brings us to the end of today's session. So I hope we'll have a few more minutes to take a few questions, and of course there will be a question and answer session at 1:30 over in Hine Hall. So thank you very much. Yes, ma'am.
I actually have 2 questions, and you can answer whichever one you want to. The one is an observation, actually. When you looked at the informal interaction between the instructor and the students, your result actually doesn't agree with the information that Aston found. So I'm wondering what the difference in the informal interaction is within the classroom as opposed to informal interaction of students outside the classroom with the instructor.
That's interesting. So our questions having to do with informal interaction between students and instructors, they don't exactly have to do with in-class. I mean, it's what we were trying to take account of was the fact that in rooms like this, there's often a lot of informal interaction because the professor's not up there typically. You're not typically on a podium. You're kind of down here milling around, and we've observed a lot of students just talking to instructors in a very casual manner. So I'm
looking at, I'm just, and the other one is, have the instructors who teach in these classrooms, did they change the assessment? Because the students might be developing different strengths, but are the assessments measuring those things?
The assessment, in all of the studies that I just showed you, the assessments were exactly the same. In some cases, we're looking at final grades, not the best outcome measure in the world. In the chemistry study, the efficiency study that I showed you, we used a standardized measure developed by the American Chemical Society. But all these things are assessment sensitive, for sure, but it was at least identical across the conditions. So, thanks. Yes, ma'am. We'll bring you a microphone right here.
Were students, did they self-seat or self-select, or were they, did you manipulate, for lack of a better word, the seating arrangements?
In the studies for which I remember how the students got to their seats, I can't guarantee this is all of them, but in most of them they were assigned to seats, and that was done randomly. So that the instructor used a random number generator and said, this is 1, this is 2, this is 3. So
That matters Because if they knew each other, then the context of what, would be
right.
different, so.
If students are going to sit at these tables, you have to figure out how to put them at the tables. Do you let them just self-sort? That's one option. Do you do it randomly? That's what most of our faculty members have done. Or you can intentionally sit them at tables based on characteristics you want to distribute in some considered way. So there are those options. I think the worst outcome is when they seat themselves.
Absolutely. We used the, we decided after, in the second semester, we knew the students, so we seated them according to their strengths and not so strengths.
Yeah, yeah, that's a good idea. So, yes, ma'am.
I have actually two questions. They're a little bit different. One is, how do you explain the comfortability that the comfortability classmates have with each other has a negative effect on the student learning? That just seems so counterintuitive, but how would you explain that? And two, when you do, as you showed with that last case where you split the class in three and you have learning materials that students have in advance, do you ever then have to counter the objection that we're doing twice the work now, this is, you're adding to our work time or something of that effect from students?
Right. I see what you mean. So to take the second question first, yes, sometimes students do complain about that sort of thing. In this case, they didn't have to come to class twice a week, right? That is to say, they came just once and not 3 times. And the amount of time that saved them was sufficient to overcome that particular objection. The other question you asked about why do student-student general relations, why are they negatively predictive of student learning outcomes? And by the way, we keep finding that. The measurement is good, it's measuring something, and whatever it measures is not good. We've found this in numerous different classes of different types, sizes, academic levels. I don't know. I mean, look at the questions, you tell me. So we can identify the phenomenon, but we don't have an explanation. We have 2 hypotheses. One is that students are distracting each other from what's going on in class, right? And they're not on task. The other is that they're misleading each other in some way. So they're taking each other off track, and they like each other so much they're not willing to raise objections and so forth. But we're just guessing, really, and we're trying to design studies to investigate that. So.
On that same note, what about students of the same major? So like, I know that a lot of the studies that you showed, they were, non-science majors or general core classes. What about students that are all in the same major and invested in the same program? Have you seen that same effect as well?
Not yet, because we haven't studied a class like that yet. But that sounds like a great project for you, because you are a Mosaic Fellow, am I right? So yeah, okay. That sounds like a wonderful research project, and I look forward to reading your results. So,
So quickly, I want to ask you about third element in active learning, because it seems like you've done a lot in technology, but also in the pedagogical actually delivery style. But what about creating or helping faculty for active learning? You need interactive content, which maximize or optimize the use of technology. What do you guys what did you all do on that?
I think that was for Christina.
So are you asking in terms of faculty development?
Interactive content, which allows you to use technology to create more focus on learning versus teaching.
I'm still not quite sure. You're asking us what type of academic technology we use?
No, interactive content, which is actually, for example, learning activity that uses the technology, such as could be animated graphic, it could be everything that focuses or places more focus on learning versus teaching, so the students would spend more time in interacting with the content versus and using the technology.
Okay. And I'm very sorry, but you're asking us, well, what did we do to support that in terms of faculty development?
Or even providing helping with creating that content.
Okay, all right. Wanted to make sure I got it right. So what I'm about to say stays in this room, okay? I think Minnesota did it all wrong, and we did not have a plan for how to help faculty use the active learning spaces and use the technology. And the few bright spots that Walker talked about were faculty who self-enrolled in faculty learning communities to use academic technology in their teaching. We are now starting to correct that. I'm actually facilitating an active learning classroom, faculty learning community, where we're introducing them to different types of technology and how to use it, and it's, they observe other people teach, and then they are observed teaching and with a heavy technology focus. But it took us a long time to get there. So I think you all here at IUPUI are ahead of the game in terms of addressing these questions. Did that answer? Okay.
And we're bumping up against 1 o'clock, so maybe we can take one more question.
This is a short question, quick question. Back before technology, there was a concept called accelerated learning. Is this a cousin? Is this related? Is it the same thing as accelerated learning principles, just infusing technology?
What do you mean by accelerated learning?
Look it up. It's the same type of principles in pedagogy of active participation and engagement of learners with a very structured set of activities to enable students not to just listen but to participate fully in the learning activity. Mm-hmm. So it's just, I was just wondering because, again, back 25 years ago, mm-hmm. we talked a lot about accelerated learning, okay. and I'm just wondering, is this the evolution adding computer technology to that? Because if so, again, it gives a lot of context for people like me to understand exactly what you're speaking
right.
of.
Got you. So I have two things to say about that, and then I'll give it to Walker to see if he wants to add to that. First of all, I think that the main idea with the creation of these spaces is that it is reducing an energy barrier for faculty to engage in active learning activities. It is much easier to get your students to interact when you all face each other around a table, and that may foster certain types of activities in instructors just because of the conformation of the space itself. The other thing I'm going to say, and we don't know the answer to this yet, it may be that what's so great about these rooms has nothing to do with technology. It may be the round tables and the whiteboards. And we hear that a lot from instructors who say that's the best part of the room. So I hope somebody here wants to do that study, because if the technology isn't what's important, it's a cost saving.
And just to add to what Christina said, without being familiar with the term accelerated learning, my suspicion is that the answer is yes to your question, and that there are some pretty basic cognitive mechanisms and principles that are the reasons why the techniques Christina was talking about have the good effects that they do. And I suspect that those principles and mechanisms, things having to do with memory and perception and so forth, underlie why accelerated learning works as well. And with that, I think we should probably wrap it up because it's about 1 o'clock. So I just wanted to say it's a real honor to be here. I think y'all are doing great stuff. So thank you very much.
Just a few more comments. We have recorded this session, and this session will be in about a week or two, I believe, on the Mosaic website. So we will have close-ups of the slides, which will make it easier for you to see the slides if you would like. I want to remind everybody that Walker and Christina have generously offered to spend another hour with us from 1:30 to 2:30 in Hine Hall 118, which is just around the corner. Terry Tarr, director of the Teaching Center, and her staff can guide everyone to that space, and then they will convene the session at 1:30, just a few minutes from now. If you would like to learn anything more about the Mosaic initiative, please visit the Mosaic website. You can contact me through the site or ask anyone from the Teaching Center. So thank you all for attending.